два слова для того, чтобы дополнительно представить Серджио Сисмондо. Вы видите его апелляцию, это Куинс Университет, Канада. Но самое главное для нас, наверное, с точки зрения учета вот того контекста, в котором он будет выступать, это то, что он является главным редактором известного и очень рейтингового журнала Social Studies of Science. Поэтому, просто перед вами человек, который находится в гуще событий, понимаете? И вот его название этого доклада как раз об этом говорит. То есть, переводя на такой обычный русский язык, это доклад о той самой круговерти, которая вот происходит в этом самом СТС. Какие-то там онтологические повороты, другие повороты, в общем, вот всякие вот эти водовороты, короче говоря. Вот он в гуще этих водоворотов.
Very, very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. It was really a pleasure to be invited to the Institute of Philosophy here and to be able to meet many, many new people, and it's very, very exciting for me. I've never been here before, not to Moscow, not to the Institute. I had real sort of panics yesterday as I was listening that people would find the paper that I gave sort of uninteresting and dull. And so in order to, and I still have some concerns that might be so. So what I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to present that paper, but I'm also going to present a little bit of my current empirical research by way of illustration of some of the points of the paper. I wish I could do more, but that's the combination I'm going to do. And I'm actually going to start with that. Start with the illustrations before I get to the other point. The reason why I say that you might not be interested is because, frankly, the paper that I gave was me trying to puzzle through a new set of ideas that I'm not sure are going to last or anything like that in STS, and quite possible that many people are not familiar with not even the ideas nor with what they're reacting against and so on and so forth. So it's possible. So at least you can walk away learning something new because I'll give you some empirical material. So I'm going to start by telling you about KOLs. These are key opinion leaders. The idea that the opinion leader was established by the sociologist, communications theorist Paul Lazarsfeld, but also others, Elihu Katz and others, back in the 1940s and 50s. And this idea, the opinion leader, is the idea is that there are certain people in nodes in society who have disproportional influence. So here's one quick description of the opinion leader by Philip Topham. Now, the key opinion leader, or KOLs, is the standard abbreviation in the pharmaceutical industry. In the pharmaceutical industry, KOLs are employed. They're doctors or researchers who are employed to speak to other doctors or researchers. And so here, Philip Topham is a fairly academic version of a consultant who works for the pharmaceutical industry, identifying people who will be good candidates for key opinion leaders. And so he says that KOLs are these highly respected medical experts who have asymmetric influence on their peers, asymmetric effects on their peers. The pharmaceutical industry funded one of the key studies of opinion leaders back in the 1950s. Actually, it was not the industry, Pfizer, the company, funded, and then that grew into a way of dealing with doctors and researchers. Topham, his agency, produces graphs like this, which will be recognizable to people in STS. This is a version of a citation map, but there are many other ways of mapping the influence of KOLs. KOLs, so this is asymmetric influence. So, most of my information comes from attending conferences about how to, let me just put one up here, how to manage KOLs. That's how the pharmaceutical industry normally talks about KOLs. How do you manage KOLs? So they talk about KOL management. So here's, but I also am drawing on interviews with a number of prominent KOLs. I'm drawing on interviews with people who earned more than $100,000 working for the pharmaceutical industry in 2009. So in the 1 year, they earned more than $100,000, mostly speaking, right? Speaker's fees. So here's Dr. P. This is actually from a conference, not from an interview. But when you're being asked to be the thought leader, that's a bullseye, exactly where academics live. And I think we can recognize this. That's why I'm here today, standing behind this podium, right? When you're asked to be there, that's where academics live. So that's one way of seeing what the thought leaders do. Thought leaders are managed, incidentally, by plans like this. This is a representation, visual representation of a set of electronic documents. The pharmaceutical company will have sort of their plan for, you will meet with Dr. So-and-so on such and such a date with such and such intended outcome, right? And so on and so forth. And then, after that, they will be asked to speak at these following venues and so on and so forth. There are different, incidentally, there are different levels of KOLs. KOLs I divide them into 2 different categories. Within the industry, they're often divided into 3 or 4 different categories, depending on whether they have international, national, regional, or local scope. I divide them into researcher versus physician KOLs, and I'm sort of which I think is actually more important for an analytic purposes than sort of exactly how their scope. Researchers generally talk to other researchers, but also to physicians. Physicians talk to physicians. And so that the distinction is really just sort of how they see their roles. So that's one presentation of KOLs. Here's another presentation of KOLs. This comes from within the pharmaceutical industry, or closer to within the pharmaceutical industry. So here's a marketing firm that works for pharmaceutical companies that says KOLs are a convenient shorthand for those people, usually eminent, usually physicians, who we co-opt into our development and marketing strategies. We bring them into our strategies, right? Or here, a pharmaceutical sales rep talks about the use of KOLs as salespeople. Key opinion leaders were salespeople for us, and we would routinely measure the return on our investment by tracking prescriptions before and after their presentations. So in other words, the KOL gives a presentation to a bunch of physicians, often in a clinic, sometimes after dinner, and then the salespeople will look at the prescriptions from the audience before and after. And KOLs earn good return on investment. Incidentally, this is an international phenomenon. It exists everywhere that there are pharmaceutical interests, basically, and so that means it exists in North America, Western Europe, and although I haven't studied in Russia, I'm sure it exists in Russia too. KOLs are trained before they even get to speak, especially the physician KOLs, but also the researcher KOLs are trained to be more effective speakers. So here is a company that does some of this work, says it's vital that advocates are able to communicate and influence colleagues with clarity and conviction, right? To ensure speakers are at the top of their game, we've developed a communication skills program for clinicians. And I've had the training described to me, what it looks like. You spend a weekend in a hotel typically, and you learn about typically a small number of studies. You learn about a small number of studies, but also then how to present them. But in fact, the physician KOLs are often extremely highly regulated by the companies. Not so much the researcher KOLs, but the physician KOLs are actually presenting slides that have been prepared for them by the companies. And they're expected to stay closely on script. There's a script, they're expected to stay very, very closely. This is because the companies actually can suffer serious repercussions there can be big disadvantages for anybody who is a spokesperson saying things that might be illegal. Marketing of drugs is a highly regulated area. So here are a few of the interviewed KOLs just talking a little bit about the money, about earning money in order to speak. So, and they all recognize that they're paid, of course, but it comes up in the interviews, but they also want to say, well, look, the payment is not the important part. It's something different, right? My kids are grown up. I helped use a lot of the income to support my parents. We're paid well, but we're paid, I think, fairly, says Dr. C. Which leads to another representation of KOLs. They present themselves as educators and experts, right? And also as helping to heal people secondhand. They're also often physicians, so they're seeing patients firsthand. They're helping to heal people firsthand, but they're also helping secondhand. So here are a couple of responses that, here we have people sort of objecting, saying, don't just see us as paid salespeople. You're not just a paid monkey reading slides, says Dr. Q. I won't be a paid stooge for somebody, etc., right? All the interviewed KOLs want to assert that they have some independence. They want to insist that they are doing what they do because they believe in the product. So, and they're educating. I'm educating fellow physicians, right? I spend my day educating patients, I spend my evenings educating fellow physicians, and I'm very comfortable with that, says Dr. A. Or here he is again. It helps other patients elsewhere. It's spreading the word, it's spreading the gospel. So, in other words, you have information about a drug, the company is paying you to present information about the drug, and you take it to other physicians, spreading the gospel about this product. And every single one of the interviewed KOLs talks in these terms. I believe in the product that I recommend, says Dr. F. And I won't say anything that is untrue. Absolutely nothing that is untrue, right? It's all on script, of course, but it's nothing untrue. There's a sense in which they always want to emphasize their expertise. Whether that is practical expertise as physicians or expertise as researchers, that they believe in this product, they believe in the data that they are presenting. So let me just set all of that aside. That's the kind of one aspect of the kind of work that I do in the pharmaceutical industry. And incidentally, it is so much fun. I get to be an investigative journalist. I get to, that Steve was talking about yesterday, I get to go to these pharmaceutical industry conferences and sit there as a fly on the wall and listen to what people say. And it is fascinating. If you want a different view of the world, go to things like that. Absolutely fascinating. But let me turn back to philosophy for a bit.
There we go.
So I want to tell you a little bit about a turn in STS that's being known as the ontological turn, and I said the ontological turn because I'm not sure that there is one, and this is me puzzling through these things, but. Even before I get there, I want to say, so one of the things STS, Science and Technology Studies, is doing a set of things that I find really fascinating. They are deflating a lot of traditional areas. And so I've thought a lot about, for example, this minor issue here, that areas of inquiry become objects in a sense, and for ontology, that was done a long time ago. And STS does work that is sort of poking at some of these ideas. So traditional ontology was, as I say here, for the most part, reified as a singular and stable reality. And that's being challenged by a bunch of work in STS, also in philosophy, although I attended a talk in philosophy only 2 weeks ago on ontology, and I found that the traditional view is alive and well, please believe me. But it's being challenged, it's being historicized, made contingent, and deflated. And I think STS has been deflating a number of things. It's by studying empirically the construction of knowledge and many other things. And now it's studying being itself, right? That is the ontological term, is to study being itself empirically, which you think we would leave to the scientists after all. In the deflationary move, STS has moved to studying empirically the idea of the construction of knowledge, which means studying construction empirically. Doing this as a bit of empirical philosophy and also knowledge empirically. Let me say a few things about construction, because I've talked about construction for my whole career. So one of the things that I've done in analyzing what construction means in STS is broken it apart into a number of different kinds of claims, and I'll just talk about a few. So one of the things, so this is the overarching rubric for constructivism in STS, the idea that science and technology are importantly social, that they're active processes, and that the products of science and technology are not natural. That one way or another, they're not natural. I won't say that they're artificial, but I think that's a word that might have too loaded connotations, but they're certainly not natural. That breaks down into many, many different kinds of claims locally. And here's one set of 4. So there's the construction of social reality. Easy, right? Stemming from work by Berger and Luckmann from quite some time ago, we know that social reality is socially constructed, and Ananda was talking about that yesterday, right? There's also the construction of scientific and technical things and phenomena. This rat is constructed, right? This rat is very, very finely tuned research apparatus. What this rat does inside the lab is also a bit of finely tuned phenomenon. It's a phenomenon, whatever this particular rat is made to do, whether it's made to move around in a maze, whether it's made as a... sorry, this is actually a mouse. I was looking at the picture. That's not a rat. It's a mouse. It's still constructed. People started constructing mice as laboratory objects back in the 1930s. And the laboratory mouse is genetically homozygous. That means that both sides of it are identical down to as close as we can possibly measure, right? There are many different varieties of laboratory mice, and then they're made to do many, many different things. The varieties have different properties. For example, some are more aggressive. Some display a propensity to alcoholism, which you might actually think is actually a very, very useful property in a laboratory mouse, right? Which is because, or a propensity in the opposite direction, etc. And then you make them do artificial things. You create phenomena out of these artificial worlds. Sorry, I spent too long on that one. There's the technoscientific construction of material and social world in big ways, right? All sorts of ways. And then putting a bunch together, we might talk about the heterogeneous construction of things and knowledge, right? We might think of this as roughly actor network theory-ish sort of work, but it doesn't really matter to me whether it's actor network theory or precursors. In fact, I took this diagram from a researcher named Peter Taylor, who wants to sharply distinguish his work from actor network theory. Doesn't really matter. Multiple domains coming together. And there was a nice talk yesterday in one of the sessions, one of the afternoon sessions about that, at least as far as I can understand. So In all of this, and there are other kinds of constructions that are going on in science and technology on STS kinds of analysis. I chose pose 4 that suggest that STS has been taking an ontological turn since the 1970s. And otherwise, this would be completely uncontroversial, right? That constructivism would be absolutely, totally boring if we didn't think that there was some kind of ontological turn going on. But let me talk about the more recent ontological turn. And I think that there are sort of 2 different flavors. I'll split the first one into 2 parts itself, but that's not necessarily too important. Here's one, Ian Hacking's historical ontology. So this is under the social construction of social reality part, I think. And what Hacking wants to draw attention to is what he calls dynamic nominalism, where social kinds, where you might start with, say, a classification, and then if there are also, say, unhappy people, institutions for dealing with the unhappy people in terms of the classification, there's knowledge about the unhappy people. Hacking's primary example is multiple personality disorder. That's the one that he has spent the most amount of time looking at. Multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder is one that basically did not exist before the 1950s. There were no cases of multiple personality disorder other than the very few cases that were used to establish the classification to begin with before the 1950s. And then in the 1950s, in part sparked by a movie, The 3 Faces of Eve, about multiple personality disorder, but also some popular magazine articles and other things, we start seeing cases of multiple personality disorder. People being classified this way, people identifying this way. And then you establish knowledge, experts and professionals for dealing with these things, all sorts of ways in which this happens. And by the 1970s, multiple personality disorder is a major phenomenon. There are many people with multiple personality disorder by the 1970s. It continues to grow into the 1980s and has been leveling off since. There are actually fewer people with multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder today than there were 20 years ago. So it's a classification in some decline. Here's another version, I think, of historical ontology, Lorraine Daston's version, which I think is mostly focused on what she called biographies of scientific objects. It's a roughly Bachelaudian view, where scientific laboratories or the scientific world more generally becomes populated, sometimes depopulated, with these phenomena. And since I spent a lot of time on the mice and the phenomena around mice, maybe that will just serve as my example of that. So that's one stream of the ontological term, and I actually think it's a fairly uncontroversial one, in a way, at this point. It's become fairly uncontroversial, but maybe I'm wrong. The other stream is, I think is increasingly being known as empirical ontology. And this is ontology read off of practices of engagement, and especially professional practices. And Anna-Marie Moll is more responsible than anybody else for putting this on the table. For Moll and people who find this approach to doing research attractive, what is one of the primary conclusions is typically that ontology is multiple. So here we have a quote from her from 2013, and so she says, on the surface, food is fuel, input or nutrients for a body that may be normal or deviant. Behind this is a second layer. Food is pleasurable, desirable, and part of daily life. And so what she's looking at is nutritionists' advice, right? So this is professional practices of offering advice. It's a little distantly removed from science, I know, but we'll just take this as a bit of applied science. And so this is the kind of multiple. And the is in these quotes, which appears twice, is important. Food is fuel, food is pleasurable, right? What she wants to insist is that there's a kind of multiplicity of this work. Is this just perspectivism? I mean, we can see a possibility for that in John Law and Mariana Lean's claim. This is a quote here: the turn to ontology in STS is part of a much wider intellectual and political movement in Western thinking that can be traced back as far as Nietzsche. And I got a headache when I read that, I must admit, because thinking of multiple ontology in terms of perspectives seems to me highly problematic, right? That would be a mistake if we were going down that road, right? So here's just really briefly a few objections to thinking about ontology in terms of perspective. First of all, I think we've learned, there's the resistance is liveliness or agency of the things that are being described. Think back to the KOLs, for example. The KOLs don't want to be read as salespeople. They resist that, right? At the very, very least. There's this claim that built into the idea of a perspective, we would never talk about a perspective if we didn't account for the possibility that the perspective is wrong, or that when representations are representations in virtue of a possibility of being wrong, which is another way of, maybe just another way of putting the first point, slightly differently. And as a result, I would say that perspectivism is either really boringly representationalist. It's just to say, now we're only going to talk about ontology as represented, right? Or it's highly idealist, where you're saying that the ontology is somehow automatically created by the representation, right? And both of these positions look, well, the first is boring, the second is, I think, highly problematic. And finally, let's say a political objection. I think many people would object to the idea that descriptions of people, or particularly interesting kinds, maybe even mice when count, are really true one way or another, just simply in virtue of being good descriptions, right? That was a wrong turn in the turn to ontology. And I'm not actually going to claim that Anna-Marie Moll or people who follow Anna-Marie Moll are taking that turn. In fact, they emphasize perspectives. The occasional thing that might be written sounds like it, they emphasize practices. And the occasional thing that might be written sounds like it's perspectivist. And I think some of the incautious readers of the ontological turn see this in terms of old-fashioned idealism, which looks just very, very attractive to some people. But I think actually what we're really talking about is practices. And I'm going to use the critique. By the way, the wrong turn, I think, it's not. I'm not just putting it aside. I think this is the wrong turn might help us to understand what's attractive about seeing it and seeing ontology, in part in terms of practices. So here's Moll again. Instead of singular, ontology has become multiple, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We ask about how reality comes to be coordinated in scientific and practical practices. Or, going back a bit, her book on arteriosclerosis, a cardiovascular condition, explores the way in which medicine attunes to and interacts and shapes its objects in its various and varied practices, or enacts, how medicine enacts the objects of its concern and treatment. And what she showed in the book is that medicine enacts arteriosclerosis in several different ways within a hospital, right? So the different ways in which arteriosclerosis, I'm just going to use a mole sort of emphasis, is, or really is, the way that arteriosclerosis is, she wants to claim, is different in these different parts of the hospital. Or Steve Wilgar and Javier Lezaun, a new curiosity about the way objects are enacted in practice. Oh, sorry, they're quoting. Now, these are not just epistemic practices. Ian Hacking emphasizes epistemic practices in his historical ontology. And what he's doing is, when Ian Hacking, in that what I claimed is now pretty uncontroversial Foucauldian project, what he is doing is he's emphasizing how especially epistemic practices, then can be used, leveraged, etc., to become stable kinds of things, to become long-term. So in multiple personality disorder, we may not think of 40 years, 50 years history of multiple personality disorder as all that long-term, but it has a certain kind of stability now. And so that epistemic practices establish the possibility of multiple personality disorder as a long-lived kind, as a long-lived way of being, right? But the new empirical epistemology emphasizes other forms of engagement in addition to the epistemic practices. And so a couple of examples, Law and Lean's example was about choreographing, which is, I think, actually a really nice word for some of the stuff that goes on. Farmed salmon, sort of how you make something into a farmed salmon in this sort of complicated word. Again, we're a little far from, or more enacting arteriosclerosis. So let me return to the KOLs for a second. There are multiple descriptions of KOLs, but they're also enacted in various ways. And I think that sort of using a empirical ontology kind of emphasis, there's emphatic ontology I want to claim here, KOLs are influential nodes in networks, KOLs are salespeople, and KOLs are independent advisors, educators. So they are all three of those things, and they're enacted in different ways by different people, by themselves, even by different areas within the pharmaceutical industry. They might be enacted or choreographed, managed, to use the industry term, in different ways. They are managed, right? They're trained and contracted to speak. The KOLs are tightly constrained. So choreographed, yes, choreographed. A salesperson will want to put KOLs in different places so as to speak to the right target audiences, the right physicians who will then go on to prescribe the drugs. But they also refuse to do anything that they see as diminishing their own agency or integrity as doctors, as educators. Right? So they want to enact themselves, the KOLs want to enact themselves in a different way. Incidentally, I mean, there's a kind of ideology critique that one can adopt here. I don't think I'm just going to say it, I'm not going to do it. Right? We might want to say that KOLs are somewhat blind to the other enactments of them. I'm not sure, I mean, well, actually, we could talk about that if you're interested. But I want to say, so what comes out of this is that from the point of view of doing STS research, it's actually these verbs that matter. It's the coordination, the enactment, and the choreography that matter. And the ontology is the ways of being is a kind of abstraction away from just mere objects that are being shaped. And again, what we've done is we've taken something that was we've deflated. There's a kind of deflation of ontology going on here to just simply talk about objects or kinds or groups of objects, and the practical work, the eminently practical work of making them do what you want them to do, right? And sometimes how they resist making them do what you want them to do. This has just become ordinary, mundane activity. Nonetheless, there might be something valuable for thinking about ontology here. And if you want to have this deflationist attitude, if you want to be adopting this attitude, I actually think, of course, things change their behavior and properties in response to coordination. And the empirical ontology, in a sense, draws our attention to that. It draws our attention to that in ordinary practice. Ordinary practices are always changing the behavior of things. And so if we've been willing to, if we're willing to step away from that unified, singular, stable ontology that once populated philosophy, if we're doing that, then I think a practice-oriented, and certainly not a representation-oriented approach to ontology makes a lot of sense. It seems as good a way of understanding at least some aspects of ontology, not everything, not the things with which we have no practical engagement, but other than that, as good a way of understanding ontology as any. Although I do think we're just back to a kind of constructivism here. We've just returned, in my analysis, to something at least for which the overarching metaphor of construction works perfectly well. Enactment, choreographing, coordinating are just different versions of the construction metaphor. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for the interesting speech. I think we have some questions. I will wander around and provide you the microphone. I think we will not start with Steve.
He had his hand up first. This guy had his hand up first.
So, my question, whether this multiple ontology deals exclusively with socially relevant phenomena, or can it comprise the physics, the chemistry? What about atoms or particles or such kind of phenomena? Thank you.
I think absolutely. There's no reason why empirical ontology wouldn't be dealing with all of with things. I mean, I would call them socially relevant too. In a sense, the empirical ontology, one of the things to which it draws attention is precisely the social relevance of non-human objects as well. So hacking, I think, is wrong in sharply distinguishing the social categories from the natural categories, and he even violates his own distinction. So, I mean, he probably knows he's wrong. But yeah, and there's a sense in which empirical ontology draws our attention to how atoms are socially relevant categories. But if we prefer non-human.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk. We all together are chaos 4. We are steered by Casale. We learned to speak naturally, and we don't say things of which we wouldn't mean that they are correct. But I don't remember that we are getting $5,000 each. which, due to your ideas, should be the minimum, I think. Well, let me start from your idea of ontology. Ontology had been the prime philosophy originally, from Aristotle up to Christian Wolff. And then Kant changed the whole thing and said, first, knowledge. And the categories of knowledge are the conditions of the ontology. And this still holds. And that's the reason why there are different kinds. Well, we cannot speak on something which we cannot observe, think, reflect on, and so on. Aquinas ontology, to me, is to be the value of a bound volume, is empty. You would have to say what the universe of discourse is. So one has to say, what are the objects, namely objects and processes we need? What are the relations between these objects? And this is a part which is extremely open. And most of the ontologies today are very, very small ontologies in most cases. And I think one should pick up, for instance, Nikolai Hartmann, New Ways of Ontology. He tries to include as categories and objects all those items with which we are dealing. That means not only objects as chairs and so on, but biotic objects, but all what belongs to Popper's World 3. Ideas, feelings, and so on that are in World 2 have to be installed within a ontology which would be rich enough to deal with the problem you are dealing with. So the ontologies you had in mind are much too poor at the moment, for they are, as this depends on the tradition, they are much too static, and we do not have laws of the dynamism of groups which one would have to include if one intends to develop an ontology. So there are two ways. Either we say this is a restricted ontology, or we try to open it, and I think the fruitful way must be to open the ontology and to introduce completely new concepts, or for instance a kind of teleology, for all our actions are teleological ones. I never found a modern ontology which really would take this into account. We have to include the possibility to form groups, new form, and to give new groups an own structure. So we have to enrich the ontology by concepts of that kind, which then are rich enough to describe what is going on in the groups of medicines or in STS study. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. First, actually, KOLs might be paid as little as $500 for a talk. They don't all get $5,000 for a talk, but they're well organized by the sales representatives so that they can give multiple talks to add up to the $5,000. But minor points.
If you would get it, go to the industry, you would get it.
Yes. I am sympathetic with parts of what you're saying, quite sympathetic with parts of what you're saying. I haven't read the Hartmann. I don't know this. I'm actually, I have to admit, I'm to some extent in unfamiliar ground here. But I'm sympathetic with parts of what you're saying. But I actually think that the STS approach of investigating this in a sense from the ground up, in a sense from starting off by looking at how other actors who we might care about, how other actors sort of interact with the world, and to start to say that's an approach to ontology that feels comfortable to me. And I feel somewhat less comfortable sort of imagining that we're going to start establishing structures, even if they're going to be quite open ones, structures that will allow for all the things that perhaps those actors might value, right? So I think it's a direction. Even if those structures are extremely open, I'm more comfortable taking the empirical approach. I don't know if I'm entirely comfortable with the empirical approach as it has been taken in recent years, right? I don't know that, but I think that the direction. But I like the direction. It's again, I use this metaphor of comfortable. It seems to fit for me.
I think very interesting. I don't follow part of the discussion. I follow what Hans is saying. Let me ask two closely related questions. One concerns the notion of an ontological turn, and exactly what you mean by that, and what there was before there was an ontological turn. That's the first obvious question. And second, when you talked about the ontological turn, you talked about perspective. Now, and you connected that with Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche's view implies that there only are different perspectives all the way down. But now, it seemed to me you were saying something different, in that you seem to me to be saying that we could distinguish between perspectives, which perspectives were acceptable or right, and which perspectives aren't. But the kind of perspectival approach that Nietzsche favors denies that you can distinguish, because we can't get at what's real. So this would be a way of making a claim about knowing the thing in itself, whereas it seems to me a perspectival approach has to deny that.
Right. So the first of those questions, I'm adopting the term. I'm adopting the term, the ontological turn. I don't actually think that there's been anything radical, that there's been a radical move, except to explicitly think in terms of ontology, right? I actually think that there's a sense in which people have been doing this for a long time. And we can look at antecedents. And I actually think you can look at, maybe Carnot, maybe Kuhn. These are, maybe Quine even. There's a kind of antecedents to the ontological turn. Within STS, I think that there are a number. But STS has decided to explicitly think about ontology. So what's the ontological turn? So now how am I using this term? I think all I mean to say is a new focus on ontology from an empirical direction, right? That's I don't really mean to fill in I don't want to fill in the details too much more than that. The second question, that's a good question about Nietzschean perspectivism. But I still think that we, in the kind of competition among perspectives, we might be uncomfortable saying that things are, rather than to say that there is no way in. So I think that the Nietzschean perspectivism should push us, in your sense, in the sense in which you just drew it out, should push us to a direction to say there is no way that things are. There are only perspectives all the way down. Whereas the ontological turn is trying to say things are in one way or another, right? And occasionally slips into something that looks like perspectivism. And that, I think, is a mistake, right? That we should definitely avoid that path. That would be the wrong turn, right? The wrong turn would be to say simultaneously there are only perspectives, and yet those perspectives give us, in a sense, a structure of being. Right?
You'd only get an appearance and you'd never make a claim for reality on your ontological theory.
Oh no, I think that the practices give you a claim to reality quite in sort of in an ordinary way, the way that ordinary practices interact with things, right?
So we have 5 more questions. I encourage everyone to be as free and concise as possible.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Sergio. I have a comment on the way that the word ontology is used, and I think there's a great confusion around it, and that might be why people also seem to be talking past each other. And I've noted that all these different terms appear in your presentation and in the people you're quoting. So first, when people say ontology, it's usually defined as the study of the nature of reality, right? It's not about objects of reality. And I think there's a big difference, because the first ontological act is how you choose to delineate things in reality. So for instance, and I'm going to use this because I want to use it for my second point, Anne-Marie Moll's quote on food. You first have to say, I'm taking food as an object in reality, which is one way of identifying the contours of an object of reality, right? There is a choice that we make here. Reality doesn't tell us, this is how you look at me, how I singularize. I could be looking at the forest or a tree, right? This is an ontological act. It's the first one. But then it establishes a shift from ontology as the discourse on the nature of reality to a conceptualization of objects, which then could move, because you can say I'm looking at the system, and within it I'm looking at a subsystem. This becomes more at the level of theory than ontology. But it seems that people move, especially because they're not philosophers, they move very often, social scientists, to ontology as a study of things, which gets them to talk about agents and structures as if this was ontology. It's not ontology. This is how we conceptualize reality. It's nothing to do with the nature of being, right? Which is more of a metaphysical. Now, the other point, and I think it's related to this, is that we start talking about ontology as if it were a characteristic of objects. So in Anne-Marie Moll's quote on food, where she says food it can be seen as a fuel, and it can be seen as pleasure, or the source of pleasure, or whatever. Well, that's not the ontology of food. That's the ontos of food, if anything. But that quote refers to Marie Moll's ontology. It's a logos, right? It's a discourse on things. In that case, the food is the thing, it's the object, although I think it's wrong, because it should be something about reality, not about food. But it's Anne-Marie Moll's ontology. So if STS has an ontology, if it is going to study ontologies, then it's a meta-discourse on the way that we conceptualize the nature of being and the nature of reality. And it seems to me that this is being vulgarized to the point where words have no meaning anymore, because the logos part of the word, it's a bit like epistemology, right? It's a logos, it's a study of knowledge. So if we can pluralize it, we can say epistemologies, but then it is a study of the many ways in which we conceptualize the ways that we know. It's not a study of knowledge is, right? And I think it's the same thing here, that there seems to be a constant confusion. Objects don't have an ontology. We are subjects who conceptualize being in different ways. And I'm going back, perhaps this links back into what my senior colleague was saying, with all his wisdom about precisely these older philosophical traditions, that if you're talking about perspectives, if there are so many ways in which objects can appear to us, because there is no secret to what their nature is, there is only our conceptualizations of what they are, that in fact, ontologies, in the sense of discourses on the nature of things, if there is no one way of measuring whether they are right, but only of measuring whether they are useful or how they are political, because it's a political act, right? And this seems to erase it completely. Then it goes back to an epistemological question. Whereas all ontologists want to say is that it's not about epistemology, it's about ontology. but they're erasing the act of conceptualizing.
What? Yeah. Are you actually going to answer this, or do you just accept this as a comment? You should accept it as a comment.
No, I'm not.
She's absolutely right.
No. I will not accept that quite just without any response. I think philosophers are hypocrites because philosophers want to make the move that you say, but then they start talking about ontologies and an ontology as if it is the object. So philosophers want to say, no, it's just social scientists or some lay people who make that mistake. But when it's convenient, philosophers make exactly the same move. And I think that's why I put this slide back up. Because actually this is a standard move in the English language.
Okay, this is where my question comes in, exactly on this point. Because I would have thought that the precedent for what you're describing is ordinary language philosophy. Remember ordinary language philosophy from the 1950s and 60s? All you old guys will remember this in the English-speaking world. What was that about exactly? It was exactly about this, right? Where in a sense you read ontology off language and you conflate the distinction that's being made here exactly in the same way. And it's a little interesting, considering this is all coming from francophone types, right? People who claim to be metaphysically sophisticated in all this. That really what's being recreated here is stuff that you could have found in Peter Strawson, right, or Austin, right? People who are basically reading ontology off language, right? And what were they reacting against? They too were reacting against Carnap and the logical positivists and all these other reducers and so forth, just like the STS people are reacting. But they don't seem to have any of that understanding. They're just reproducing the same kind of pattern, including the meta-level mistake that's being pointed out here. I'm just saying, do you have any, I'm just sort of curious about this, because it almost seems like there's a kind of historical amnesia that doesn't come from the too distant past, right? Because it was guys, people like Strawson and Austin who were reacting against the reductionism of the positivists and Quine and all these people, right? And they basically came up with an ontology that's not so different, recognizes multiple types of entities. They're not all materialistic. They all coexist on an equal plane, right? All that kind of stuff that we have today. And it was just read off of language. And I'm just wondering, what do you make of that? Is there something different? Let's put it this way. But let me put it constructively. Is there something different about what's being done now from what was being done, let's say, in the 1950s?
Yeah. So I think that comment is right on, up and including the question. So the comment is right in that this is being done in the same spirit. It is absolutely the same spirit, and you're right that there is no reflection on that past. Except that people understand that representation, language, and this is the answer to what is different, right, is just a sideways move. It's a sideways move away from language towards practices of engagement. Practices of engagement that reshape objects, that they effectively
so it's dynamic.
It's dynamic.
Yes.
It is effectively reshaping objects, right? And that, the hands-on part of this is important, right? Even if it's not exactly hands-on, even if it's engagement on a discursive level, this is what is new. And you won't find that in ordinary language philosophy. The mistake, so they're avoiding the big mistakes of ordinary language philosophy. Perhaps they're not avoiding all the mistakes.
I agree. I grant that. Yeah.
Right. So.
But I think but it would be interesting to reconnect in a way.
Yes, you're right.
Yeah, I think we take one more question, and for the others, I must apologize, but I think Sergio will be around all day.
Give her answer.
What do you think about beings and things is being ambivalent or malevolent, multitude, or what is your opinion? And the first question about Heisenberg, Werner Gersminer and his idea about the means which we study the nature and things, and you follow him, I think.
Can you tell me, sorry, who you were referring to? I missed the name.
Heisenberg, Werner Heisenberg.
So, are we studying beings? At the very least, we're studying things. Yeah, right? And we're studying structures of things. I'm entirely comfortable with that. I'm not sure I know how to answer your question. I apologize, but I think, am I following? I am entirely comfortable with the idea that we're studying things, and we're studying natures or something like that. Beings, if you want. Beyond that, as we interact with them.
Means which means we use to know, to study. Excuse me for my English.
No, I'm sorry. I wish I spoke Russian. I don't think I have to yoke this to a pragmatist view of knowledge, but I think that that's a natural companion, right? I think that it's a fairly obvious fellow traveler to say that there's a pragmatist, but I don't think it's necessary. That is, I think we can still treat, for practical purposes, representations in non-pragmatic ways, right? Maybe you want to have a deeper pragmatist analysis. That's a possibility, but I'm going to remain neutral on that one for today. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.